Hello, everybody, and today we're going to be focusing on the Columbian Exchange, which is going to be our third topic of the fourth unit of maritime empires between 1450 and 1750. In the last lecture, we talked about how technologies and developments allowed for the Europeans to start expanding beyond just West Europe and eventually finding their way into the Americas. This lecture focuses on the consequence of that interaction, which we refer to as the Columbian Exchange. So, with that, we'll take a look at a general overview. So, one thing that we want to focus on is that the Columbian Exchange is an example of a consequence of connectivity. In other words, we've already talked about in this semester so far the idea that when cultures interact, there's cultural diffusion, there's technological diffusion, there is the spread of religion, the spread of diseases. And the Columbian Exchange is yet another example of that type of interaction. So when we talk about a definition, what we want to do first of all is realize that this is an interaction between the Western Hemisphere, which is the Americas, and the Eastern Hemisphere, which is Afro-Eurasia. And when we talk about Afro-Eurasia, we're really emphasizing the impact of Europe on the Americas, as Europe is the one that's going to start developing colonies within the Americas, developing a colonial system of government that controls the Native Americans. The Europeans are going to introduce enslaved Africans into the Americas. So we do kind of have to keep in mind that a lot of this is going to focus on Europe. But the Columbian Exchange is also going to be impacted by those enslaved Africans and African culture, as well as Asia being influenced by these developments in the Americas. So we want to recognize this as a global exchange that is going on between the two hemispheres. This exchange involves plants, animals, people, and diseases. All four of those are going to be the major categories that we're going to divide this lecture up into, and that you can remember or you can use to remember the impact of the Columbian Exchange. So if you remember those four things, plants, animals, people, and diseases, all you have to do is then just stem the information off of those four categories, which is what this lecture will do. Third, we also want to consider that the Columbian Exchange impacts culture and the environment, particularly of the Americas. The European, Asian, African culture is going to be impacted certainly by the incorporation of the Americas into the global trading system. But we're not going to see the impact on the environment the way we'll see it in the Americas, or the impact on Native American culture is going to be much more extensive than what we'll see in terms of the impact on European and Asian culture. When we talk more about the slave trade, we'll talk more about the impact on African societies. But again, the biggest impact is going to be on the Americas. So what really separates this Columbian Exchange from other examples of interaction or consequences of connectivity is the scope and the size of this. Just how much this connected parts of the globe, the fact that this form of connection brings together two hemispheres that up to this point were unknown to one another. So you're going to have a much bigger scale and a much bigger impact, not just immediately, but in terms of long-term impact on both societies, both hemispheres, and particularly within the environment. And speaking from a biological perspective, the Columbian Exchange is a big moment in the history of species within this planet. Letter D is a reference to a historian named Alfred Crosby, who's the one who coined the phrase Columbian Exchange. And it was his works that really is the basis for everything we talk about when we talk about the Columbian Exchange. So I want you just to recognize Alfred Crosby as a historian who lays out this argument, lays out this idea that we refer to as the Columbian Exchange. And then finally, just as a reminder, Western Hemisphere means the Americas. Eastern Hemisphere means Africa, Europe, and Asia. So make sure you know, as I'm saying, Western and Eastern Hemispheres, you know where I am on that globe. So next, we're going to start breaking down the Columbian exchange into four key components. First is the exchange of crops. Sorry, I ran out of breath. The exchange of crops. So one of the things we know from history is that as regions interconnect, crops are transported along the trade routes and introduced to new areas that the crops were not native to. And of course, our ultimate example is champa rice. We just can't forget champa rice. But the idea that citrus fruit gets introduced throughout the Mediterranean as a consequence of increased trade within the Mediterranean world would be another example. It's just that the Columbian exchange takes this to a whole new level, and it introduces a variety of crops both back and forth. But there is going to be a major difference between the nature of that exchange. So when we look at New World crops or Western Hemisphere crops that move into Afro-Eurasia, there are three major examples that I just want you to keep in mind. If you look at the graph, you can see a variety of examples: tobacco, squash, the peanut, the corn, tomato, vanilla. But the three big ones I want you to focus on are potato, maize, and cassava or manioc, maniac, cassava, which some of you may recognize as yucca. It's a root-based plant, that an edible root. So those are your three big examples. And of the three, the one I really want you to highlight and know is the potato. So here's the big thing. And number two is the one you want to star and really understand: the impact on Afro-Eurasian populations. So we have this flood of new crops, and the potato and cassava and maize are really good at growing in difficult regions or difficult farming areas. And what that leads to is a sustainable crop that can supply the nutrients and calories necessary for a human diet. And as a consequence of these new world crops coming in to the old world, to Afro-Eurasia, populations are going to grow everywhere. So, for example, the potato comes into Ireland, and Ireland's going to start cultivating the potato more than most other countries. But that cultivation of the potato is going to lead to a population boom within Ireland. That's not just happening in Ireland, it's happening throughout Northern Europe. It's also happening within Asia. The Ming and the Qing dynasties both see a huge population boom because of the introduction of the American crops. And in the case of Africa, the introduction of cassava and maize are two big crops that really help to grow the African population. And the idea is that when there's more food available, more people are going to live longer. And that means population will go up. The third thing I think is really important: the cultivation of New World crops. What I want you to see is that between 1450 and 1750, crops that are getting introduced into Europe, Africa, and Asia that are coming from the Americas are being utilized by the farming peasant class of those three regions. And so the idea is that the Irish peasant, the Irish farmer, is cultivating the potato. It's not necessarily that there are potato plantations. What's happening is that these crops are being integrated into the already existing farming world of Afro-Eurasia. In other words, there is already agriculture, large scale agriculture throughout Afro-Eurasia. And these crops are being put into the rhythms of farming that have already been established. When we look the other way and we watch from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, the three big crops that I want you to look at are sugar, wheat, and cotton. Again, if you take a look, you'll see the coffee bean is going to get introduced, the peach, the pear, citrus fruits, bananas, olive, but then you see sugarcane. And to me, sugarcane, grains such as wheat, and cotton, which I think is somewhere on the map, are going to get introduced into the Americas. And this is going to dramatically change things because, unlike the other way, these crops coming in are coming in for the purpose of being cultivated for sale. And this leads to the formation of what we call plantation agriculture. And what's happening, let's use sugar because sugar is the one. Sugar is the crop you want to circle because it's going to be a driving force within the Americas. So when Europeans come over and they see all this land, they know that there's a crop in high demand back in Europe, sugar. So what they do is they say, look at all this open land. And of course, there was natives on the land, but we'll talk about what happens to that native population. They say, look at all this land available. Let's start planting sugar here because sugar is something we can make money off of. They're going to do this with wheat. They're going to do this with cotton later on. We're going to call these cash crops. They're crops that are being grown for the purpose of selling as opposed to a purpose of consuming. And so what that leads to is the practice of slavery in the Americas or the American slavery system. When I say America, I'm talking about North, South, and Central and the Caribbean islands. I'm talking about the whole Western Hemisphere. And the plantation agriculture is going to grow to a scale where there's a high demand for labor to work the fields. And that's where you're going to bring in enslaved Africans at some point because that demand for more workers is going to lead to an increase in the enslaved African trade that takes place across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, and we're going to talk more extensively about that in another topic. But one of the last things is this impact on the environment and biodiversity. It is said that one of the great natural advantages any plant or animal has, the one evolutionary advantage, is its usefulness to human beings. So wheat, sugar, cattle, they're all useful to human beings. We consume these things. So therefore, we're going to cultivate and encourage those crops that best supports our lifestyles. What that ends up doing is crowding out native species. And that's certainly what's going to happen here. As sugarcane is introduced, as wheat is introduced, as cotton is introduced, that is going to push out native crops to the Americas, which is going to certainly change the environment. And that changes the biodiversity of the Americas. Another thing that the environment is affected by is the clearing of trees to make room for farmland. So as the Europeans come in and they see this land, they see the biggest problem is to clear the trees out of the way, which means that you're going to affect the environment through deforestation and also from using the same piece of land to grow the same crop year in, year out. You're going to exhaust the soil. You're going to have desoilization. And soil erosion. And again, those are all consequences we've seen before and is also going to happen here in the Americas. So now we go from crops to animals. This is going to be a shorter version. When the Europeans come over to the Americas, they bring with them livestock. They bring chickens, they bring pigs, and they bring cattle. And those animals are going to populate and drastically change the American world. And it's going to change the world in terms of these animals coming in and grazing and altering the natural environment. It's also going to start changing the diet, introducing new types of foods into the American cuisine. And I want to pay particular attention. I'm sorry, let me go back to one more thing with the chickens, pigs, and cattle. Of course, we should also throw in there oxen. And oxen are beasts of burden. That's going to allow for improved agriculture. So one of the things you should remember is that when we talked about the Americas, we always emphasized how they did not have these beasts of burden to cultivate large-scale agriculture. With the introduction of the Europeans come the animals necessary for that large scale agriculture in the Americas. The introduction of the horse. I have here a picture of Native Americans hunting a buffalo on the back of horses. And this is kind of a classic image that people have about the Old West. And the idea is that this image didn't exist until the Columbian Exchange. As the Europeans brought over horses, Native Americans are introduced to horses, and it begins to change the Native American culture. So, for example, if you remember in the Mississippian civilizations, we start seeing in about the 900s the development of an agrarian society. Over time, as the horses get introduced, we're going to see these agriculturalists start shifting over to a nomadic existence as they follow around the buffalo, because the buffalo had a much more valuable commodity, their furs. And the Native Americans can only make that transition from agricultural to nomadic because of the horses and allowing them to ride and move about quickly to follow the buffalo herd. So you have this idea that the Columbian Exchange can impact a whole society, and it can create a nomadic society by virtue of the introduction of the animal of the horse. And again, this comes back to the impact on biodiversity. We start bringing in these animals in, they're going to start crowding out the animals who were native to the American landscape. And then when we look at the introduction of American animals to Europe, there is certainly some animals that cross over, but they're brought over more as curiosities. They're in some cases going to serve as the main course of cuisines for the wealthy. For example, turtle soup is a great example of a New World animal that is brought back and is high demand for dining purposes. But the idea of American animals in Europe is at a much smaller scale than the other way. European animals are going to have a much more dramatic impact on the Americas than the other way around. And whatever was introduced to the to Afro-Eurasia from the Americas during this time was introduced more for the sake of curiosity and for consumption amongst the upper class. Next, we take a look at the exchange of diseases. Now, this is the big one that usually people refer to when they think of the Columbian Exchange, is how Afro-Eurasian diseases come to the Americas. So the European explorers show up, unwittingly expose the Native Americans to a variety of diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, those are the big three. You can put in chicken pox in there. There's a whole host of diseases that have existed for thousands of years within Afro-Eurasia. But what's happening is that the Europeans and Africans and Asians, they've built up an immunity over time because of their exposure to the disease. When I say immunity, what I really mean is the ability to fight off the disease. They don't always succeed at fighting off the disease, but they have a greater resistance to the disease than the Native Americans do. When the Native Americans are introduced to these diseases, it's catastrophic. The scope of death among the Native Americans is, well, you can see it in the curve for Native American population of central Mexico. And it goes from about 25 million in 1520 to about 1 million in 1600. So you have this dramatic decline because of the exposure to European diseases. And this is the big one that kind of stands out with the Columbian Exchange. It's the thing you want to star the most and know, like the back of your hand, is that the biggest impact of the Columbian Exchange is that European diseases were introduced into the American societies. The Americans did not have the resistance to these diseases because they had never been exposed to anything like it. And there is a fast and rapid death total. You're talking about, over time, maybe about 90% of the indigenous population is going to be killed off because of all of this. And that dying off is going to weaken empires. It's going to vacate villages to the point where Europeans see What they see is just empty land. But in truth, what's happened is that the people who live there have all died off. Now, this is going to have an impact on enslaved labor because initially, when the Europeans come over, they put the Native Americans to work in forms of slavery. However, as this population rapidly declines and the demand for labor on plantations start to grow, the Europeans are going to shift to another source for enslaved persons, namely Africa. And so this is going to also impact the introduction of enslaved Africans into the Americas. And then lastly, this disruption to Native American societies. The Aztecs and the Inca are going to be devastated by these diseases. Certainly, they're conquered by Spanish conquistadors, but the diseases weaken both empires significantly. And this is going to happen up and down throughout North and South and Central America, where diseases are going to devastate those complex societies that we studied back in Unit 1. And then it should be noted that as enslaved Africans are introduced into the Americas, malaria and yellow fever are also going to be introduced. So when we look at number 1, in a way, this isn't terribly different than the spread of the bubonic plague along the Silk Road or the spread of Europe Western diseases into Siberia as Russia started to expand, or the spread of malaria throughout sub-Saharan Africa as the Bantu migration pushed forward. But the biggest difference is just the scale at which it impacts that Native American population. If you think that the bubonic plague kills about 25 to 33% of Europeans, here we're talking about diseases that kill approximately 90% of the population. That's how complete and total it was. The last thing I should mention with relationship to letter A is that not only are the Europeans bringing over the diseases, one infected European sailor could be responsible for the spread to a whole village, but they're also bringing over disease vectors. Rats are coming along to the ships, and those rats are being introduced into an environment they have never been introduced to, and they're going to help to spread diseases as well. So disease vectors, those agents that allow for the spread of diseases, are going to be introduced into the Americas as well. Now, were there American diseases that go over to Afro-Eurasia? To a much, much smaller scale. And that is something important to keep in mind. You cannot equate these two. The American population is more devastated by the disease element than the European, African, and Asian populations. At best, there might be some connection to an outbreak of syphilis in 1494, which is a sexually transmitted disease that had spread through West Europe. There's some evidence to suggest that maybe that's not connected to the Americas. It depends who you talk to. But even that does not have the scope of its effect that we see with the European diseases introduced into the Americas. So make sure you don't equate those two, but it is an example of a disease being introduced into a new population. So our last one is the exchange of peoples. So you have this drop off of Native Americans, but then you have an influx of Europeans. And the Europeans are coming over to the Americas for a variety of motivations, but the ultimate motivation is that the Americas offer an economic opportunity. For a lot of these Europeans coming over, this was a place of plenty. There was food here. You could have the land to cultivate and grow. You could own a lot of land here that you could never own in Europe. So the motivations are largely tied to economic motivations. This desire to basically become wealthy by virtue of the plantation economy, fur trapping. The Americas offered a host of economic opportunity. As the Europeans come in, and this is going to be the crux of the rest of this unit, one, they have a political impact. They start to establish governments, and they start to politically organize the Americas in a way that hadn't been organized before. The great empires of the Aztec and the Inca are going to be destroyed. And in its place will come the Spanish colonial system. Later, the English will establish a colonial system. The Dutch will establish a colonial system. The Portuguese will establish one in Brazil. The French will establish one. And now we have the five major European powers coming in and establishing colonies. So that is going to change the way the Americas is politically organized. Second, there's going to be an economic impact. Two things that are going to happen, and we're going to talk about one of these more extensively later. One economic impact is the beginnings of a plantation agriculture. Land being used to cultivate crops, particularly sugar, to sell back into the European markets. Tobacco would be another example of a cash crop. Later on, cotton will be one. But the idea of using the American lands to cultivate a crop that's in high demand in Europe is going to be a driving economic impact. And that is certainly not something that the Native Americans did before. That's not something we saw in the Americas. A second impact is going to be the mining of silver, particularly in South America, in a place called Potosi. And again, we're going to talk more about the silver trade on its own. But this idea of mining for silver becomes big business because silver is going to become higher in demand. So basically, the Americas are used to satisfy demands throughout Afro-Eurasia. And then fourth is a religious impact, the introduction of Christianity. And Christian missionaries are going to come over to the Americas and begin to spread the Christian faith. The reason why so much of South America and Central America is Catholic is because the Spanish were Catholic. So those missionaries come over and begin the process of converting the Native Americans into Christianity. So Christianity is going to be introduced. We'll talk about how Christianity starts to integrate in with Native American and African religions. Which brings me to the second thing. The enslaved Africans who arrive into the Americas are going to certainly have an impact on the development of the Americas. So in terms of the motivations, why are enslaved Africans coming to the Americas? As the plantation economies grow, there's a greater demand for, for labor or for free labor. And that initially were the Native Americans. But as the Native Americans die off from the diseases and the demand starts to increase even more for the cultivation of sugar, Africans are going to start being used as the source for that labor. And that's the beginnings of the transatlantic African slave trade, or the incorporation of enslaved Africans into the Americas. And that is very much connected to the plantation agricultural system. These enslaved Africans are being put to work harvesting and dealing with sugar, and then later on tobacco, and of course from the United States history, the association with cotton. So this idea is that without that plantation agriculture, you don't have that rapid growth of enslaved Africans, within the Americas. Then the third thing is, since we have these three groups, Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans, there is going to be intermixing. And children are going to be born who have their heritage in multiple worlds. In other words, they're not just coming from one group, but they're becoming what we would call biracial. So this is going to create what's called the casta, or the racial caste system. So what happens throughout the Americas, but particularly in South and Central America and the Caribbean, is the development of a class system, a hierarchy of social classes, which is defined by racial heritage. So at the very top of this social hierarchy are the peninsulares. And the peninsulares are those Europeans who are born in Europe living in the Americas. So they're European, but they were born in Europe. The Creoles, which is the second group, the Creoles are going to be those of European descent who are born in the Americas. So the mother and the father are both European, and the Creole is an American-born to European heritage. The mestizo is the combination of Native American and European heritage. So you have this blend of European Native American heritage. The mulattoes are going to be a combination of African and European heritage. And, we develop a group that we would refer to as mulattoes. And then lastly, the other classifications that include Native Americans, African slaves, and the mixture of those two groups. So if you take a look at the picture to your left, you'll see artwork that represents the different type of child and what that child will be classified as. And there are names, if you can't make it out, there's names under each one. And when you see 16 of these, it really starts to speak to just how much the society used ethnic heritage to define the individual. And what this racial caste system does is it determines privilege and access within the society. And that's something we're going to be talking about a great deal more later in this unit. And then lastly, we have a mixture of European, Native American, and African culture. And we're going to see that not only in the mixture of the two groups and the production of a population that has their foot in different heritages, but we also see it in music, in religion, we see it in cuisine, we see it in language. What happens is we have that blending and that syncretism of culture that's going to come out of the mixture of these three different groups. So that ends the Columbian exchange. And the next lecture is going to start breaking this down, looking at how religion is interacting with the globe. So we're going to be kind of focusing on the consequences of this European interaction with the globe with a heavy emphasis of its impact on the Americas. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I wrap it up. As always, bring your questions to class for any clarification, and I will see you next time. Bye.